For every question that Berserk answers, it leaves us with two more to scratch our heads over. Kentaro Miura's masterpiece has been in circulation for over 3 decades with nearly 400 chapters published, and yet we still haven't received answers to questions asked all the way back in 1995. If you want to know about these mysteries, we point you towards our top 15 Berserk mysteries that remain unsolved video. As for this one, we're going to hone in on something that we were made first aware of in Chapter 53, Supreme King Geiseric's 1,000-year-old Continental Empire. Or, more specifically, what happened to it. Because while we have more information about the end of Geiseric's rule than his actual lifetime, what we know is conflicting, which is probably worse than knowing nothing in the first place. But then again, that's why we're here, and it's also why you're here watching this video, so let's get straight into it. This is the fall of Supreme King Geiseric's empire. Investigated. Before we get into our video, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. He's the only person in recorded history to unite the continent of man under one banner, but no one knows how he did it. Supreme King Geiseric and Midland's history. In Chapter 53, we get a history lesson about the Kingdom of Midland from a most unexpected source, Princess Charlotte. Well, it makes sense considering she was probably the most well-read person in the Griffith Rescue Party, but unexpected in that we did not think this girl would be duping guards and dropping knowledge on us after everything we saw from her earlier in the Golden Age arc. While descending the Tower of Rebirth, Guts, annoyed by Princess Charlotte's upper crust shenanigans, decides to divert his mind by asking her just how deep the damn thing's underground levels ran. On the surface, the Tower of Rebirth was pretty massive, no doubt about it. It was easily one of the biggest structures in Windham City and could be seen from all across town. But while the tower was impressive on the outside, it was uncannily ominous on the inside. That's because right in the middle of the Tower of Rebirth was a gigantic gaping pit that seemed to go on forever. According to Charlotte, the official dungeons of the Tower of Rebirth ran no deeper than the height of the tower itself, but the abyssal hole underneath those levels had always existed, and were a legacy left behind by Midland's dark history. 1,000 years ago, the Kingdom of Midland did not exist. Instead, humanity's continent was populated by a fragmented patchwork of warring tribes and city-states. Miura gives us a delightful spread showing two parties in the middle of a charge, with the POV side donning Viking-esque armor and attempting to take over a pyramid-like fortress. Keep these details in mind because they will be important later on in the video. Charlotte claims that this age of warlords was so blood-soaked that a full third of the entire human population died due to war, plague, famine, and the like. Then, from out of nowhere came a man who not only subjugated the warring nations under his rule, but managed to forge the only continent-wide empire ever established in the history of humanity, Supreme King Geiseric. No one knew which land he came from, how he raised his armies, or why he fought to conquer in the first place. But by the end of his conquest, everyone recognized him as the supreme ruler of all mankind. No records exist of Geiseric's life before he established his empire. This makes Guts think of Griffith at first, because on the surface, Griffith and Geiseric's life stories sound pretty similar. But then, Charlotte says something that makes Guts think of an entirely different character, and this is where things become interesting and also relevant to our video. The princess claims that because of Geiseric's merciless and ruthless fighting style, his enemies gave him many monikers like the Demon King or the King of Galloping Death. But there was another reason for this. Geiseric would always ride into battle wearing a helmet that was shaped like a skull. This makes Guts immediately think of the Skull Knight, but while he dismisses it, the thought stuck with us. If you've seen any of our videos on the origins of King Geiseric, Skull Knight, and Void, you know our thoughts on the matter of whether Skull Knight is Geiseric or not. If you haven't, go watch all of those and then come right back here. But to make a long story short, we think Skull Knight is, in fact, King Geiseric. We'll also get back to this detail a bit later on in this video because we're not done with Charlotte's history lesson just yet. Her story about the lifetime of the Supreme King prompts Judo to recall a story himself, that of the fairy tale of the Skull King. Apparently, Geiseric was so infamous once he became emperor that his life became the subject of fables and literal fairy tales. According to the one about the Skull King, it is said that after the titular ruler established his empire, he gathered workers from all over the continent of man and forced them to build a massive capital city through harsh labor. Then the king proceeded to spend his days in extraordinary lavishness, while he levied heavier and heavier taxes on his subjects, and his capital city devolved into becoming a den of gluttony and pleasure. Finally, after the king's excesses had reached a critical point, God decided he could not condone Geiseric's actions, and so he sent down 5 angels to destroy his capital. In a single night, the city that had been built by the blood, sweat, and tears of thousands of humans was turned into rubble by natural calamities like lightning and earthquakes, and just like that, the Skull King's story got its fairy tale ending. But as soon as Judo got done with his version of the tale, Casca refuted his claim about the angels by asking him whether the number was 5 or 4, and this is where things start getting confusing. The group decides it doesn't matter, but Charlotte tells them that the city itself was real, and that its remains are what lie at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth. The Kingdom of Midland had received its name from Geiseric's capital, which lie in a land in the middle of nations. The Supreme King did not have children himself, so there is no way to verify this, but the Midland royal family is the only family in the world that can claim descent from him. They say that they carry his blood in their veins, which is probably what they used to assert their rights over all the land that was previously a part of Geiseric's imperial capital. So this all seems like a fairly straightforward story about the fall of an ancient civilization, right? Charismatic hero shows up out of nowhere, unites humanity, establishes advanced kingdom, and watches it devolve into sin until one day it's given the Sodom and Gomorrah treatment. But then, Casca's torch falls into the hole that supposedly doubles as the tomb of Geiseric's fallen empire, and Miura decides to follow it on its way down. At first, we see things that can be expected from such an imperial capital. Broken statues donning elaborate armor, the ruins of pantheons and colosseums with artwork that looks like it came straight from the Sistine Chapel. But then we notice the mound of dead bodies scattered all around the pillars that line the bottom of the pit. And there are 2 things to take away from the panels that come next. Number 1, the human fossil can apparently go without turning into bone dust for close to 1,000 years, and number 2, someone became either an apostle or a god hand the night Geiseric's empire collapsed. That's because the corpses at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth all sported the same thing emblazoned across all of their foreheads: the brand of sacrifice. This is baffling because this is the first time we see this brand on anyone besides Guts himself, and it once again leaves us with more questions than answers. We know that the Tower of Rebirth was built to effectively seal off this dark past of the Kingdom of Midland, and we now know that Geiseric's fairy tale was in fact a real story. But how exactly did his capital city become the haunt of thousands of skeletons, all sporting the brand of sacrifice? Well, the answer has actually already been given to us. For the most part, at least. A massive sacrifice that probably took Geiseric by surprise. What we think caused the fall of Geiseric's empire. Remember how we said that there was a dispute about the number of angels that destroyed Geiseric's kingdom? Well, if you've seen our 4 Kings of the World video, you'll know more about why that dispute exists. Once again, to make a long story extremely short, it appears as though the formation of the 4 was invoked during the fall of Geiseric's empire, because the Holy See, which rose in its aftermath, records the 4 kings as being their cardinal angels. The dispute exists because in chapter 138, we learn about a certain sage during Geiseric's time period who proclaimed the king's sins to God whilst being tortured daily, until one day, his prayers were answered by an angel. This sage is assumed by most people to be Void before he became the brain daddy he is today. If the 4 kings were invoked to protect Geiseric's city from some kind of astral disaster, then it makes sense that Void's presence could inflate that number to 5, as the God Hand have been repeatedly referred to as the guardian angels of desire. Void is also presumably the guy responsible behind the branding of those Midlanders we saw down at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth. Now, yes, Void was said to have been tortured at the Tower of Conviction, but St. Albion and the rest of Midland were all part of Geiseric's capital city, not just Windham, which is where Falconia stands today. So the Tower of Conviction would technically still be a part of the same city as the Tower of Rebirth, making the presence of those branded bodies a bit more sensible. As for the reason behind how physical bodies could retain the brand of sacrifice and still exist within the physical world despite having clearly fulfilled their purpose as offerings, it's simple. They're not exactly in the physical world. See, Falconia is said to be King Geiseric's capital city reborn because, as Guru Gedfring explains in chapter 345, that's exactly what it is. His wording is the real clue here though, because he calls Falconia an ancient metropolis that Griffith restored to the world at the base of the world spiral tree. This suggests that the entire city had actually crossed into the astral world during its fall, and that Casca's falling torch breached the divide between real life and the afterlife. So there we have it, right? Void gets tortured by Geiserik, keeps chanting his sins as a way to stay sane, eventually loses it, sacrifices all of Midland to the idea of evil, and emerges as the first God Hand member. Except, well, Chapter 362 tells an entirely different story. Up until this chapter came out, everyone thought that the God Hand started with Void and built up to Griffith, and that Void was just the fifth guy being conflated with the Four Kings because of the status that the God Hand holds over demonkind. Chapter 362 disproved all of that by showing us Void being accompanied by 4 other demonic-looking entities, who are unlike any God Hand member we've seen in the story. They look more monstrous, and the interstice in which they manifest is notably missing the massive Hand of God that appears every time we see the God Hand in Berserk. And also, another key difference is the fact that the Abyss itself is prominent in the background as Geiserik looks upon his arch-enemy. Oh, and how do we know that this is Geiserik? Well, that's simple. All of Skull Knight's interactions on Elfhelm practically spell this out. We'll speak more about this in another video, but suffice it to say that before Guts got a hold of it, Geiserik was the owner of the Berserker armor. This makes sense because we're constantly told that the astral and physical worlds overlapped with one another back in those days, which means that Geiserik didn't just brave physical threats, he also braved astral ones. During his conquest of the world, he must have reached Skellig Island at some point, which is when he discovered Elfhelm and met Flora the Witch. Geiserik must have also held court at the island, or had some of his subjects go to it, because Guru Gedfring is actually from his day and age, and the Skull Knight still remembers him as Void's son. The reason we even know what Void's sacrificial ritual looks like in the first place is because we're told it was Skull Knight's last living memory that bled into the Berserker armor itself, which he was wearing at the moment of his death. So what does all of this amount to? Well, we'll try to explain it as simply as we can. King Geiserik rose up in a world where magic was still a dominant force and launched a successful world conquest. At some point, he met the mages of Elfhelm and became close friends with Flora and a lover to the Lady Priestess of the Cherry Blossoms. He also probably got the Berserker armor here from Hanar, although that could have also happened elsewhere. With his conquest complete, Geiserik returned to his intended capital and then, we don't know. Before his passing, Kentaro Miura did say that he wanted to explore Skull Knight's backstory a bit more. In the last chapter of Berserk, which we broke down on Marvelous Anime, we saw that Griffith wanted to go to the east, a place where we haven't been in the series so far. If you ask us, this is what happened. Geiserik probably dabbled with some magical stuff he didn't quite understand, and his mess around find out moment came when Void triggered a massive sacrificial ritual to become a literal demon. There is probably some truth to the fairy tale of the Skull King, but based on the reactions of people who knew Skull Knight before he was Skull Knight, we have to say that Geiserik's story has probably been clouded by the fog of history. What happened the night that his continental kingdom disintegrated is crucial to understanding what will happen in the future of Berserk, because as Geiserik's friend Flora pointed out to him, causality is a spiral, not a circle. And just because Griffith is once again penning up humans at the site of his blood-stained fallen empire, doesn't mean that Falconians will meet the same end as the Midlanders of yore. Marvelous verdict. But we're afraid that's it for this video, as that's about all we know. Kentaro Miura once said that Berserk is a 1,000-year-long story, and by that logic, the fall of Supreme King Geiserik's empire is probably its most pivotal event, at least from a historical standpoint. It seems to be the Nexus event, which brought in the God Hand as we know it, swapped magic with the dogma of the Holy See, made the world forget it used to be united at one point in time, and also seems to echo the final infernal demonic ritual that Berserk is building up towards. What will that be? Only time can tell. But in the meantime, why don't you guys hit us with your best theories as to how Geiserik's empire fell in the comments section below, and we'll see you all in the next video. And, as always, if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, be safe out there, and have a marvelous day.